So it's lecture 5. Welcome. We're going to talk about global economic systems. We're going to talk about international trade. Obviously, commerce between various countries is a major component of international relations. Giant spy balloons floating across other countries aside. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's go ahead and get started. So there's a couple different types of economic systems, and they range from sort of simpler to more complex. At a very basic level, you have traditional economic systems that are highly manual, require little in the way of specialized labor, and they rarely produce surpluses or more stuff than people need. So if you think in terms of sort of the earliest sort of clan type systems of families and sort of the earliest elements of civilization. You probably had hunter gatherer type clans. The men would go out and hunt. The women would produce agricultural products and other sorts of things. I'm, generalizing here, obviously, but there wasn't a lot left over. It wasn't like they were farming so many different things that they could, trade that with other clans. Well, obviously that shifted over time as civilizations developed, and you end up with these two other forms of economic system that exist today: command systems and market systems. So a command system is an economic system that's heavily dominated by a centralized authority, most notably the government. And the government will regulate commerce in a variety of different ways. A true market system, on the flip side, there is characterized by very little or no governmental control, and it's principally regulated by the players in that economic system, the producers and the consumers. And then it's all sort of tied to the laws of supply and demand. If supply of something is very low, then demand is going to increase and prices will increase. And obviously we've seen this sort of as a function of the pandemic, and sort of see these kind of rolling effects from this here. So these are sort of two, think about these as two kind of polar opposite systems, but they represent sort of perfect examples of those systems. And in practice, very few economies actually, look, totally like one or the other here. In practice, most economies are really sort of a mixture of both of these. They're mixed economic systems. So, countries such as the United States are a mixed economic system that are comprised of, elements of each here. So I'm always going to use aviation as an example because that's what I know. For instance, if we were to apply a market system to aviation, that would be a situation where, airlines set their own fares. They compete against other airlines for passenger share, and basically the government kind of butts out of things. Under a command system was actually what we had before 1978, prior to deregulation of the airline industry. The governments essentially have greater control. They can set prices. They can determine where airlines are going to fly. We even actually saw a little bit of this as a result of the pandemic in my industry. So the governments ended up bailing out the airlines, the U.S. carriers, during the pandemic. In turn, sort of in trade for those funds, the government told many airlines that you can't stop serving these markets. So if you look at a lot of Eastern North Carolina airports, New Bern comes to mind, Jacksonville, Pitt, Greenville, places that have very little or very limited air service probably would have lost their air service entirely. In fact, Pitt Greenville did for a short while until the government re-upped the CARES Act funding there. But as a stipulation of the government giving the airlines money, they made them continue to serve these markets here. And then an example of a traditional system would be, you see me sitting by my plane. I look trustworthy enough, and you offer me $100 to fly you, to the beach, which $100 isn't going to cover my gas, so that's probably not something I'm going to take. All right, so Duck's here. He says, did you just suggest that the U.S. isn't a capitalist country? Clearly, you've been indoctrinated by your elitist upbringing and education. I can assure you there's no elitism here. I could tell you some stories, particularly about my dad's side of the family and where I grew up, that would surprise and or horrify you. So no, public school educated right here, so that's not me. But to the original point here, it's actually kind of hard to argue that the U.S. is even the most capitalist of countries here. In fact, most lists would put them down a ways, compared to some other countries. If you think about the United States and its relation to the economy, the government trains workers, right? So this is a government institution you're taking this class for, and and I'm, an agent of the government, and I'm training you hopefully so that it benefits you economically. The government provides roads and infrastructure. So I've been involved in a lot of sort of trade deals, over my career as a representative of the airport, and so I have a lot of details on sort of how these things work. So it's very common for we're going to build a factory, our company's going to build a factory in your town, but we want you to supply the roads and infrastructure and all that. So that's a subsidy. That's a way we subsidize the private sector here. And we just heavily subsidize many sectors of the economy there. So I've probably mentioned at some point, agricultural subsidies. So my wife's family gets, a check from the government, to keep on farming, feed corn and soybeans up in Ohio. There's other areas and avenues. Obviously, if you get the rebate for buying an electric vehicle, that's an indirect subsidy to, Tesla and those sorts of companies there. The United States does some other things that are very, not capitalist. So they, regulate anti-trade practices. So again, in my industry, we're all sort of watching the JetBlue Spirit alleged merger here, and whether or not the U.S. government will allow it to move forward. I mean, so far it seems like they will. Certain companies have to, register. So if I'm building fighter jets for the United States Air Force, I can't sell those fighter jets to just anyone. The government's actually going to regulate who I can sell those to. Another good example. So there's a lot of, very poignant examples of where the U.S. government heavily regulates industry in the United States. And so that's why we would argue that it's, not really a true sort of market economy in that sense. Let's talk about global interdependence here. So I talked about in the very first set of lecture slides in this class how really it was global trade that sort of drove globalization, and really this is a function of sort of the same story here. The U.S. Great Depression, for instance, it was really probably the first example, global example of how interdependent countries are upon the economies of other states. That was a situation where the economic conditions in one part of the world affected markets in others. I can't recall if I mentioned this in this class or my other class, but I think it's a tragedy that a lot of kids come out of high school not really sort of understanding the basis for a lot of what started World War II, and really you can point to the U.S. Great Depression, and the reason for it is that coming out of World War I, the United States, and we'll talk about this here in a second too, loaned a lot of money to European countries to rebuild, particularly Germany. During the Great Depression, those U.S. banks had to call back those loans. They needed to be repaid right away. As a result, the German mark tanked. Germany's economy suffered heavily. During those situations, you have these rogue political groups who can take advantage of that situation, and that's what the Nazi Party did in Germany. They weren't particularly popular prior to the U.S. Great Depression. In fact, they only had about 30% support, when Hitler took over as chancellor. And obviously we know how that, tragically sort of turned out, but you can make a direct connection there to the U.S. Great Depression and how its effects sort of rolled across the globe and led to, basically the start of World War II here. Now, transborder trade requires a standardized monetary system, so we'll also talk about that in this lecture here. And that ends up resulting in what we call currency standards based on resources to be able to trade. So next few slides, we're going to talk about that here. So for about 400 years, silver was the currency standard used in monetary systems for global trade, and it was the basis of international trade. So silver was incredibly valuable. Funny enough, it was actually mostly by accident. You can blame Sir Isaac Newton of Apple fame for accidentally, setting gold prices higher than the international market. So what that ended up doing was caused a rush on gold. So, this was, 1821. So this actually coincides with the U.S. gold rush as well here. And this ends up sort of being the catalyst for a change from silver to a gold system. Gold was utilized in British colonial trade, so obviously it became an important part of trade for the colonies as well, and ended up being adopted by the rest of Europe. By 1935, gold was adopted by China and then basically the remainder of major economies. And so the gold standard really was sort of established by really kind of prior to World War II. So World War One, you have the situation like I mentioned here. The British pound, backed by the gold standard, was the global currency standard. That's what international trade was based on. After World War One, the U.S. ended up, like I said, loaning heavily to European nations, including the British. And by World War II, the U.S. was actually the world's main supplier of weapons and goods. And so, in order for countries to rebuild their militaries in that period between World War I and World War II, they were heavily dependent upon the U.S. economy. And this is also consistent with the time that the U.S. economy really sort of, picked up a lot of speed and steam. It's after the Industrial Revolution. We had factories, we had workers, we were producing a lot of stuff, and we didn't have the devastating effects of World War I. So even though the United States fought in World War I, we were a late entrant into the war, and we just didn't suffer the consequences to the same extent there. So as other countries actually depleted their gold reserves to basically rebuild their infrastructure and rebuild their militaries, their own currencies ended up suffering as a result here. And so this ended up leading for a call for countries to essentially establish a formal international currency standard to basically protect from currency devaluation, all the social impacts of that there. Maybe you're old enough, if you were a kid in the 80s and early 90s, you might have watched DuckTales. That's what the picture there is from. I'll make that your code word. I'm going to give it to you early. Just promise me you'll stay to the end. DuckTales, DuckTales, one word, DuckTales. I really like that cartoon. Yeah, that's all I'm going. The Bretton Woods Agreement here. So, as I mentioned, there was this call for a international agreement to a single currency standard. You had leaders of 44 different countries meet in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. This was in 1944, so really right before, kind of right during sort of this period of World War II, actually right before sort of, the end of World War II. The agreement created a fixed currency exchange rate based on the U.S. dollar and backed by the gold standard there. So this fixed currency standard, what that meant was that, essentially the entirety of the economy, global economy, was tied to the U.S. dollar. So there would be a fixed standard. If the U.S. dollar dropped in value, then every other currency would drop at a similar level. But what you wouldn't have were currencies that, were massively devalued to the extent that it created, obviously troubling economic circumstances for that country, and then potentially, other social ills related to that, war, violence, that sort of thing here. This did stabilize global economies actually for several decades. And the problem, and when this standard, eventually came to an end, was sort of, in the period in the 1960s, where essentially the U.S. hegemony, so the U.S. being the single sort of superpower during that time period, started to give way, particularly with the Soviet economy and the Japanese economy starting to, this early stages rebounding here. This resulted in the U.S. being challenged to basically convert dollars into gold, and ultimately leading to the dissolvement of the Bretton Woods Agreement. So there was essentially, not enough dollars or not enough gold, even in the U.S. reserves, to be able to take in the U.S.'s own currency and to be able to, send it back out as gold. And so that led to the end of this process of setting a fixed exchange rate there. There were a couple other things that the Bretton Woods Agreement did that have lasted longer than the fixed exchange rate here. It created the International Monetary Fund, known as IMF. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C. This is actually now part of the United Nations. We'll have a whole section where we talk about the United Nations in a few weeks. But it's comprised of 190 countries, so most countries on the planet. They pay into a pool of money to issue loans meant to stabilize currency and encourage foreign trade. They seek to counterbalance, essentially the effects caused by private banking. So, typically, like for instance, if you're a third world country and you don't have a lot of collateral to back up a loan with, you're going to get high interest rates. It's the same thing as, if don't have good credit and don't really have anything to back up a loan, you're probably going to go to one of the payday loan places, which they were everywhere in Florida, and now I live in Cary. They're probably illegal in Cary because I don't think I've ever seen one. But you're going to get high interest rates, and it's not going to be fun. Same thing with countries, right? And so the IMF was designed to give these countries another loan option that would allow them, reasonable, sort of rates of repayment there. IMF also monitors world currencies and exchange rates, so we no longer have a fixed exchange rate, but they do monitor these just to avoid any sort of social issues tied to the great devaluation of a single currency, similar to what we saw prior to World War II. Greece was dealing with this a few years back as well, and sort of the social ills that kind of come along with that. Bretton Woods Agreement also created the World Bank. This was tasked with loaning funds to developing and recovering nations specifically here. So World Bank gave its first loan to France in 1947. As you know, due to the German occupation of France, their infrastructure was heavily embattled. They needed to rebuild here. In the 1970s, the bank was actually criticized for a lot of its poverty alleviation efforts. And so they were giving loans, particularly in third world countries with very unstable governments here. UNICEF has directly linked this to lower standards of living even today in Asia and Latin America and Africa. Facing protests, the World Bank actually stopped directly loaning or cut back on direct loans to countries and actually started working through what we call non-governmental organizations, NGOs, with specific policy areas. So that they could essentially take that money, ensure that it was being used correctly, particularly in certain areas, such as, if you were focused on healthcare, for instance, they can give the money to Doctors Without Borders, who can best sort of, distribute those funds or utilize those resources for the intended goals there. Excuse me, the duck's back. How can loaning money to a third world country at a low interest rate be considered a bad thing, contributing to worsening quality of life? So obviously it's a loan, it's not a donation. So a loan has to be paid back here. Critics historically would say that the World Bank was giving these loans to corrupt government leaders that were essentially, stealing the money, or using it for things that were beyond what the loan was intended, and really not aiding and supporting the advancement of developed countries or the recovery of countries that had just been engaged in war. Other subsidized efforts failed or produced a lot, very poor results. And what had happened is, so these countries are getting these loans for these certain programs. The programs aren't working, and the country is still stuck with the loan, and so now their debt's even higher. So it's essentially creating even more poverty than it did to begin with here. Increasing national debt tends to impact the most vulnerable of the populations the most here, and so disproportionately it's the poor that end up paying the price for these things. And obviously a country, unlike a company, it's very difficult to just declare bankruptcy and start over here. So countries' debts, generally remain with it for quite some time. And so for a lot of these countries, particularly in third world countries and developing parts of the world, some of these loans didn't necessarily really kind of help them out. So let's shift to talking about trade policies here. So obviously, as I mentioned, this is a huge component of international relations. Trade policies are basically agreements that are set between countries to regulate the buying and selling goods across international borders. These are generally set at a country by country, basis. The U.S. will have, trade policies with certain parts of the world or certain countries. Certain trade agreements exist that set multinational or multi-state standards and practices. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Key to understanding trade are what are known as tariffs, and tariffs are basically, you've probably heard that term before. These are taxes that one country imposes on another for basically allowing their goods or services to be sold in that country there. So, if you're selling spices from, the Caribbean, for instance, and you want to sell those in the United States, well, you're going to pay a tariff of some sort. That's going to basically roll down to the consumer. So if it's, $10 for a thing of spices, there may be tariffs of, $3 or $4 that you then have to pass on to the consumer. Tariffs are used strategically to raise revenue, create global influence, or protect domestic markets. So it could be, I have no idea if there's a domestic spice market in the United States here, but it could be that, hey, we're not charging a tariff here on spices. They can manufacture them so much cheaper in the Caribbean, and it's harming U.S. spice industry, companies. So let's impose a tariff that's equal to, that basically cost of production difference there to help out U.S. companies. Let's talk about just generally a high level the costs and benefits of foreign trade here. So the benefits of foreign trade, well, obviously it increases access to goods and resources, so it gives us more stuff, more products. We Americans obviously love stuff. I have a different package from Amazon on my door every day, and it's not because of me. Um, so it permits a country to focus on production of goods and services that it has a strategic advantage with. So if you look at obviously the impetus of Japan's conflict with the United States in World War II, was that Japan did not have the iron ore resources to be able to fuel its economy. And so that was a part of their colonialism and spreading out in the South Pacific, to basically be able to get access to these resources that they didn't have there. Obviously, that came at the expense of some security concerns of the United States, and all that obviously culminated into the attack at Pearl Harbor. This lowers consumer costs and cost of production. So obviously, getting items produced overseas, particularly in countries with lower, employee or sort of production, costs. Obviously, if a shirt can be produced for, pennies on the dollar compared to what it can be produced in a U.S. factory, then that's going to save the consumer money. Leads to improved, creates new economic activity that encourages labor participation. So, a lot of times people think of international trade as, you're taking U.S. jobs, but there's also benefits that are created by that, right? So if you have a store, you decided to create an online t-shirt store, and you sell your t-shirts for $20. Well, if you're able to buy those for $10 a piece, from an overseas supplier, then that allows you to create a business because your, production costs or to get the products that you're selling are cheaper there. Leads to improved international relations between partner countries. So generally, and we'll talk more about this later on, but countries that are heavily engaged in international trade generally don't, go to war with one another because they have a reason not to. Allows for allocation of surplus products. So if your country has a lot of one particular resource, more than you would ever possibly need, that gives you an opportunity to dump those items off on other consumers and get paid for it. Increases potential market for domestic, products as well in certain cases. So again, like I said, if a car, I'll use the example of, Boeing, for instance. Boeing builds, commercial aircraft, but a lot of the components, the components of a 787 come from something like, I think, 90 different countries. So that makes it easier for Boeing as a U.S. company to sell their own products when they can procure different supplies from others. So that's all the good things about foreign trade. What are some of the downsides? It increases competition for domestic markets and companies. So obviously, if you are trying to sell T-shirts on Etsy, for instance, and they're homemade, and you're doing it here in the United States, you're having to compete against an international market of competitors there. It's a weird way to think of foreign trade, but I always joke. So I coach Little League baseball, and I played baseball growing up. And I always joke that, some kid, like I joke, I might have had a better chance of playing in college and playing in the minor leagues, if not for the fact that baseball is such an international sport, right? And we see heavy Latin American presence. The Dominican Republic produces incredible baseball players, right? So it just increases competition, for those spots. I really didn't impact things for me. I wasn't playing in college or in the minor leagues anyways. Leads to reduced labor demand in certain markets and trades. So again, you may have some familiarity with the history here of, for instance, the U.S. steel industry. One of my clients is the Youngstown, Ohio airport. That market, and I actually dated a girl from Youngstown when I was in grad school for a while. That was a market that's economy was decimated by international steel trade. So this is the area of Northeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. All of a sudden, we could produce, procure steel from places like Brazil for considerably cheaper, and you couldn't pay the high wages to U.S. Steel workers that you could, previously. Obviously, we've seen this in the auto manufacturing industry as well. My wife's family were all, former GM, made incredible salaries, particularly relative to the time, for very low skilled jobs you didn't need necessarily an education for. Globalization of the auto industry, now that we can, companies can build, even U.S. companies can build cars in Mexico and then bring them back to the U.S. That obviously reduces the demand for U.S. auto workers. Environmental impacts caused by increased consumption of low price goods. So there's been a thing recently where I've seen a lot of videos of people get mad during an NFL game and then they punch their TV and destroy it. Well, that's easy to do when TVs are $200. My first TV that I bought out of grad school, I think it was like $1,200, and I had to pay it off over like 2 years or something like that. When you have these low cost goods, we consume more, right? And so those, while it's funny to watch somebody, put their head into a TV because they're dumb, that TV ends up in a landfill and it's creating, more waste. Creates labor and wage inequality, obviously. So low price goods, if you're having to compete against lower price goods internationally or abroad, the existing domestic markets and employees will struggle there. Can encourage xenophobic public response, right? So, naturally, people whose lives were upended by the increase in the trade of international steel might have held very negative views of the countries where the steel was now coming from here. And international trade can be selectively restricted as a foreign policy tactic, which creates, challenges related to cooperation, right? So obviously, our primary weapon against Cuba historically, the United States has been essentially a trade blockade. With that country, and that has contributed to greater tensions, obviously, between these two countries over time. I want to mention the World Trade Organization as well here. Founded in 1995, WTO, intergovernmental organization, is comprised of 164 countries that regulate and facilitate international trade. The goal of WTO is essentially to make trade opportunities easier. So they want to make it easier for countries to trade with one another, break down some of the tariffs and trade barriers that exist there. In doing so, they're working to support what we refer to as trade liberalization. So again, making it essentially seamless and smooth for companies between or companies in different countries from engaging in commerce with one another there. So as you might imagine, this concept of trade liberalization really sort of bounces against some of the ideologies related to particularly domestic production, specifically this idea of protectionism. So critics of trade liberalization would suggest that by having all these cheap goods flooding our market, we're not only driving down quality but also contributing to poor working conditions both in that country and here. I don't hear as much about this as you did when I was like a teenager, for instance, but the focus was on like Nike and their shoe factories in Asia, and how little they paid the employees and the working conditions there. We've heard these criticisms from I think aimed at Apple as well. Right, so it's kind of the cost of low cost goods here. Proponents, on the other hand, counter that such effects improve overall quality of life. That that even that sweatshop factory in some other part of the world, even though those conditions by our standards are very sketchy, it beats a situation where the factory isn't there at all and people suffer as a result and can't feed their families and that sort of thing. Protectionism counters trade liberalization by basically opposing globalization and free trade there. So that article I had you read that referred to nativist movements have been, that's more or less a movement in terms of protectionism here. They argue that international commerce should be limited and heavily restricted so as to principally protect these domestic economies. Obviously, Donald Trump, campaigned heavily on this during both of his election cycles and engaged in a lot of policy tactics and decisions to try and protect U.S. interests. I know I have you read an article, I can't remember if it's this week or not, that talks about some of the specific effects kind of those trade policies based on sort of what economists have kind of seen. Speaking of free trade, I want to bring up NAFTA here. So the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'm going to ask you a question on the exam, multiple choice, and tell me what NAFTA stands for, and I'll give you things that are somewhat close to it. But just know North American Free Trade Agreement. This was put into effect in 1994. It creates a trilateral trade bloc. In North America between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and essentially makes trade, basically liberalizes trade between those countries. And so we more or less have free trade across the three countries in North America. Now, economists generally consider NAFTA as having benefited of the economies of all three countries here and average citizens, but they do acknowledge that there were certain industries, the auto industry is probably the best example, where a small minority in these specific industries were heavily harmed by this. So again, NAFTA, further sort of created a tricky situation for those that worked in U.S. auto manufacturing, and so you saw a lot of like Ford and GM plants, for instance, closed in the United States as a result of NAFTA, because all of a sudden now they can produce and build those cars in Mexico, and they can bring them into the United States, and there are no tariffs applied to them. So obviously, the benefit obviously is that cars are cheaper as a result, which is weird to say because cars don't feel very cheap these days. But because of this policy, they're actually less expensive than they otherwise would be. So, I want to talk about equity in trade here because this is pretty important to international relations. Most trade agreements are bilateral, meaning they're between two countries here. But this can create international, conflicts in international relations, right? If you give what we refer to as most favored nation status to certain countries and not to others, then that could be a point of conflict and tension. Like I said, I've done quite a bit of travel as a part of trade delegations. This is a picture of me here. Much lighter and apparently much more rested. In I think that was Bogota, Colombia, where I was at for a meeting with the consulate general there. This policy is criticized by leaders who see valuable trade policies as necessary for regulating markets and engaging other forms of diplomacy. So, whether a country gives this most favored nation status to all the countries that it trades with, or if it's very selective, is based in large part upon the goals of the government, sort of how they see trade as a resource. And finally, along those lines, obviously trade can be utilized as a weapon. Not a literal weapon, but can be a way of sort of escalating conflict or maybe de-escalating it here. So sanctions and trade embargoes are utilized as tactics to reprimand countries that engage in discouraged activities, whatever that might be. Obviously, the example of our embargoes with Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria. There was an Arab oil embargo between 1973 and 74 that my mom talks about. That was when you had the massive gas lines and gas prices sort of went through the roof. Which I think they kind of are there now too, but this was especially peaked at this point. Historically, trade embargoes have rarely resulted in a change of behavior. Generally, if you look at the research around this here, obviously in the case of Cuba, it didn't stop the Castro regime from ruling over Cuba. Some critics would argue that it just really all it did was harm the Cuban people, and it harmed the opportunity for trade. So prior to the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a large source of sugar because they grow a tremendous amount of sugarcane in Cuba that supplied the United States. Obviously, there was a lot more leisure-oriented travel to Cuba from the United States during this time period too. That all sort of went away as a result of these sanctions. Some of it came back during the Obama administration. I was actually a part of a delegation. I worked to get Southwest to fly between Tampa and Havana, and was on the first flight there, and took my wife because she's a fluent Spanish speaker. We spent a day in Cuba, and it was super cool. Some of that was backtracked by the Trump administration, and honestly, I don't work in that space very often, so I'm not even familiar with what the current status is of that. But there are options for getting to Cuba now that did exist previously. So that's it. Obviously, global economic systems is a big topic. That's a class in and of itself. I've kind of tried to hit the highlights here and specifically try and hit some of the things that will sort of come back, in sort of future lectures and future topics. So hope you enjoyed that. I know it's not the most riveting of things here, but it's very important to know that international trade was really the impetus for globalization, and it still largely drives a lot of the decisions that are made between various countries and stuff. And at the time I'm filming this is the day after we shot the balloon down, so it'll be interested to see if there are any trade implications between the U.S. and China as a result of this. Well, who knows? We'll see.